I'm excited to have our guest today. She's a great friend, and we're going to talk about the Menendez case. Let's bring on the great Colonel Kurtz. There's all this new talk about the Menendez case. I guess we start at the beginning. If you could walk us through who they were and what went down.
Yeah, so I love the way you were talking about the perception of this case and these guys in the 90s, because I was really interested in the 90s in this case. Even as a precocious child, I was really into news and true crime. You can probably relate to some of this.
Yep.
And I remember, like you, that it was widely assumed in the media, certainly late night television, really among almost everyone, that these were a couple of spoiled, bratty rich kids who had been given everything in life, and they had repaid their parents for that generosity and love by blowing them to smithereens.
Right.
And so what happened was, when the trial began and their attorneys helped them to bring out this sexual abuse defense, it was not taken seriously. It was widely seen as a legal concoction to try to get them off the hook. And so when that first trial ended in a hung jury, and it was discovered, it came out that the jury hung because of all the women on the jury. In fact, there was a gender split. The men thought the abuse defense was ridiculous, and the women felt really bad and empathetic for these guys.
Right.
So there was a hung jury, the men basically one way, the women the other. And the jury was widely lampooned at the time and derided for being so stupid as to believe this half-baked sexual abuse story.
Wow.
And so then what happened was there was a second trial, and the second trial was presided over by the same judge, which I'm not an expert on the justice system, but doesn't that seem crazy to you?
Yeah, totally crazy.
And so what happened was the judge, he had been also so lampooned and derided in the popular culture and the media for letting the first trial turn into a freak show, a circus, that he decided he was going to just basically not allow the sexual abuse defense or narrative more or less into the second trial.
Wow.
And so what happened is basically the jurors were put in a position where they couldn't go the manslaughter route. And so they had to basically find these guys guilty of murder, capital murder, and they almost got the death penalty, just narrowly escaped that.
Wow.
So the story went away for a long time. And I didn't give it any thought. I assumed that they got what they deserved. But then I'd say about in 2017 or 2018, I happened to catch a documentary, an A&E documentary titled Eric Menendez Tells All. And it was a multi-part documentary and interview, not only with Eric Menendez, the younger Menendez brother, but also people who had known and worked with Jose Menendez, their father, and even relatives, even the sister of Kitty Menendez, his wife, one of the victims. And I was shocked to find out that there was actually a great deal of evidence, testimony, and really strong indications that, in fact, these guys had been terribly abused by their father, and also to a degree by their mother, who I think had borderline personality disorder and herself was full of terrors, frankly. And so, and I guess that in the first go around in the 90s, because I was a kid, I didn't really understand the gravity of the sexual abuse being described in the first trial. And so this time in 2017, when I saw this documentary, it really brought it home for me, because I thought to myself, my God, this is the worst kind of abuse. We're not even talking in this about allegations of inappropriate touching, which that's not good either, right? That's a molestation and assault. We're talking about the repeated sodomy of children and torture, and really just unbelievable sustained torture in that house.
It was, the story is crazy, and we can get into the details just so people it's worth knowing just how evil this father was, according to the kids. But
where was the mother?
Let me say one more thing,
Oh,
Shane,
yeah, go for it.
Because we're going to get into these stories about the dad and the family, and I want people to understand. We're not just going by what these two guys have claimed, because as you know, I have a YouTube channel where I devote a significant amount of time to debunking false Me Too claims, or what I believe are false Me Too claims. And so I cover the Johnny Depp case, cover Marilyn Manson, other things. And so I am not one to believe all accusers.
Right.
But it is astounding the number of people that have come out and said that Jose Menendez was possibly the worst human being they'd ever met in their life. In fact, in this documentary that I was telling you about, this A&E documentary, they interview some of his coworkers. They interview members of his own family, and they all say that he was a horrific, sadistic, terrifying human being. And in fact, the prosecution in these trials could not. They tried to find a witness to counteract the Menendez brothers' defense, and they tried to find a character witness for Jose Menendez, and they could not find one person to testify in favor of his character.
Wow.
Not one.
Wow.
So, and also there's other corroborating evidence besides testimony. There is a letter that has come to light that was written by Eric Menendez 6 months before the murders. It has been verified. The DA, the LADA accepts it. Everybody pretty much accepts it at face value. And he's talking about how the abuse has started again. He says, he even gets into, he says, I can't bear to see my dad's fat body. He's so gross and overweight. And he's talking about the abuse and how he doesn't know what to do. And his father's crazy and he's terrified. So I want people to understand that there is corroborating evidence. And there's also a former member of the boy band Menudo, Roy Rossello, who has come out and has said that when Jose Menendez was managing his band for RCA, because he was the president of RCA Records at that time, and Menudo was one of his main projects, that he was drugged and raped by Jose Menendez and that he was in terrible pain, physical pain, for weeks after. So just to go from there, I want people to understand these are very credible allegations.
Yeah. And I think there was also photos, right, of the kids that the father took, like naked photos. Yeah, it was horrible stuff. And all this stuff I knew nothing about. You only hear about the murder, and it was a ghastly murder, but you don't know anything leading up to it. The thing that I also found fascinating is that I knew nothing about the Menendez father being a celebrity of sorts. I didn't know these people had any power, putting that in quotes for people just listening, like they were in the Hollywood world. I didn't know this was even in Beverly Hills. And when it happened, I was pretty young, but like, you would have thought at least you would have an inkling to be like, these were, the elite class to some degree. I mean, like you said, he was with the Menudo, and it wasn't even until I heard that he had a connection to the Menudo band. I'm like, when I first heard it, I'm like, how does this father have any connection to the music world? And then I looked at him like, oh my goodness, he was up in the upper echelon of this world at all.
I will say this also about Jose Menendez. So he apparently was a man of incredible drive and determination, and extremely successful in business. He had once been the president of Hertz. In fact, he hired O.J. Simpson to do those famous Hertz commercials. No. And when the Menendez brothers were being held in the LA County Jail awaiting their trial, they actually spoke with and hung out with O.J. Simpson a bit and helped to convince him to drop Robert Shapiro as his attorney, by the way, because they had Robert Shapiro as their attorney and they'd not had a good experience. But anyway, I digress.
That's crazy.
But the point is, Jose Menendez, he had achieved a great deal. And yes, he was very entrenched in the entertainment industry. And so when he was killed, and he and Kitty, his wife, were killed, there were a lot of people who just did not believe that someone could be that successful and be a child rapist. And I think that is where we see the positive aspect of Me Too, or the positive aspect of a different awareness of sexual abuse and victimization that we have now as a culture, in that people now understand that yes, you can be the president of RCA and you can be hanging out with celebrities and you can be extremely successful and live in Beverly Hills, and you can also be sodomizing your children.
Right. It's like,
actually. So yeah, there's always been this dark, seamy side to the entertainment industry. And so I think that really, in the early 90s, I think people were not prepared to take the abuse of males seriously, sexual abuse. And also, these were strong, healthy-looking men when they were arrested. When they killed their parents, they were technically legally grown men.
Right.
And so people see these really, strong, healthy-looking, good-looking, virile-appearing men, and they say, how could one of these guys be bending over for his dad to rape him, regularly? Like, it just doesn't make sense. Or people would say, you don't have to kill your parents. You just leave. You just run away. Right. And to that, I would say that when someone has been abused on the level that these guys were abused, and when they've grown up in talk about an inverted world, such a crazy, crazy environment, then their thinking is going to get crazy. So I don't know what was in the head of the Menendez brothers when they killed their parents. What I would imagine is it was a mix of a lot of things. It was a mix of genuine fear. It was a mix of anger. It was a mix of, and then also personal self-interest. I'm sure, and I do think that to an extent the financial interest came into it, in that they could not imagine a life apart from the financial safety, security, I should say, that their parents had given them, their parents had instilled in them that nothing else mattered as much as success and financial security. So I'm just not sure that these guys were capable, in the state that they were in and after the abuse that they'd suffered, of just as very young adults just walking away. Right.
I also think they're so far removed from reality, because on one sense, no offense to some friends of mine in Beverly Hills, but you are detached from reality when you're in that world. It's not this world. And then on top of that, the horrible suffering of abuse that they went through, that they're saying went through since childhood, because they say it started young, right? It wasn't like
at 6 years old.
Right. So that right there just shatters anyone's sense of reality. And I think it's very hard to even try to imagine logic as we might think of it, and what they're dealing with in that world within the cocoon of Beverly Hills.
Right.
So it's really crazy.
Absolutely it is. And, there is so much that we don't even have time to discuss in terms of the abuse that they went through, even outside of the horrendous sexual stuff. I mean, one of Jose Menendez's relatives, someone who should have been inclined to defend him, testified that he saw Jose punch one of his children in the face when they were 5 years old with a closed fist, just punch him in the face. Now, this is one of Jose's relatives.
Wow.
Beat a bunny rabbit to death that Lyle brought home. Lyle brought home this bunny that he had gotten from school, I don't know, class or something, and he was in love with his bunny, and his mom said get rid of it, dad said get rid of it. He took a little too long to get rid of it, so one of the parents, I think Jose, beat the thing to death, and Lyle found it beaten to death in the trash. So we're talking again about an incredibly sadistic man and an incredibly troubled woman attached to him who had a whole range of issues of her own. And then together they just became this monster. They are the monster. Yeah. And these kids grew up in an incredibly insane, traumatizing environment.
It's hard for people to realize that these monsters are everywhere. I mean, for all the reading we've done on this show, we've talked about and things I've written about, there are monsters that are just working at the gas station. There's monsters in every level, everywhere. They're hiding. They're obviously in positions of power. They're in schools, and you have to be aware of that. I think, the thing we hear so much when these types of stories break, especially when it comes to like serial killers or serial rapists and these just evil degenerates. Oh, he was such a nice neighbor. I'm so shocked.
Well, what's funny, and yes, you're right about that. What's funny, though, in the Menendez case is that they couldn't even find someone to say he's a nice neighbor.
Right.
But seriously, I mean, it's funny in some of the documentaries I've seen, there are guys who worked with him, fellow executives, and they said that when they found out he had been shot, they weren't surprised. They said he was one of the top 5 meanest people, most horrible people they'd ever met. I mean, just everyone.
Wow.
And there were relatives also of the Menendez brothers, cousins, who lived with the family at various times, and they testified to horrible things. One of them said that one night Lyle Menendez, when he was a child, he came into her room and asked if he could sleep with her because his dad was coming into his room and touching his genitals.
Jeez.
Well, she's obviously very alarmed. She was a teenager at that time.
Right.
So she goes and she gets Kitty, the wife and the mother, and tells her about this. And Kitty's response, without a word, is to take the kid back upstairs, shut the door, never mention it again. There were other instances where a cousin who lived with them testified that Jose Menendez would take his kids into his room, close the door, and they would hear weird sounds and screaming. And they would go to try to, investigate, help. And Kitty would scream, "Don't go down there. Don't go down there," because she knew what was going on.
Right.
So this is an incredibly sick structure where the mother is not only looking the other way, but seems to be facilitating in some way or abetting this.
Was there evidence that she was being abused by him?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, she was in hell, and she was heavily self-medicating, and she was an alcoholic. So I have no problem believing that to a certain extent, her failures were results of the abuse that she was enduring. But she also had her own issues, and she would go into rages, which clench her fist. She would lock her kids in the closet for sometimes days at a time. They would have to defecate in the closet.
Oh, man.
I mean, we're just talking like crazy people.
Wow. It's crazy to me that the abuse thing just was erased from the trial, right? And I think
the second
trial
it pretty much was, yeah.
And I forget if it was during the first or second one when this phrase started being used called the abuse excuse. So that was a way to, yeah, no, go on if you know about that.
No, I was just going to say what was also working against the Menendez brothers is that their attorney, Eric's attorney, Leslie Abramson, she had developed a reputation for getting clients off using the abuse excuse. In fact, one of her previous clients that she had just gotten off, or maybe gotten a light sentence for, she had used the sexual abuse defense. And so, unfortunately, that also set a lot of people up to think that what the Menendez brothers were attesting to was just a recycling of a tried and true strategy that Leslie Abramson had been using. And so in a way, even though she was a great attorney, that sort of discredited in the public's eye the claims by the Menendez brothers.
Right. And then the way they acted after they murdered their parents was also used against them. And that's something that I do remember hearing about a lot. You know, that was
like spending money and
yeah. Like, what did they do after? They went kind of crazy, right, with the money?
Well, it's interesting. There is that is a little more nuanced as well when you actually look into it. What they have claimed is that they were raised by their mother to see spending money as therapeutic. That was their mother's therapy, they said, because she was very wealthy and she was miserable. And so in addition to alcohol and pills, she was kind of a shopping addict. She loved to shop. She would take the boys shopping. That was their therapy. And so one of the things that they pointed out in this documentary that I was watching is that while it might be perceived as monstrous behavior by people, they were spiraling. They were psychologically just completely spiraling, didn't know what to do with themselves, didn't know how to deal with their feelings they were having, the position they were in. They now no longer had any structure to their lives because the people who'd given it structure, even if it was bad, were taken away. And so they were just kind of like grasping at whatever basically would make them feel better. So I understand that people from the outside, they see these rich Beverly Hills kids, they've just killed their parents and now they're buying Rolexes or Porsches or whatever. But I just think that if you see it as a coping mechanism or two people who've just done something crazy and they don't know what to do, they're spiraling, it makes a little more sense.
Oh yeah. I know people who have been grief stricken, who are poor and still have their coping mechanism be like attached to materialism. Do you ever watch Twin Peaks?
A long time ago. I'm not conversant on it, but yeah, I mean, well enough.
It's just, I bring it up on this show quite a bit, and I think the Menendez case reminds me of it because there's a character, there's a father. So sorry, spoiler alerts, people who haven't seen this 30-year-old show yet, but it's my favorite show. It's my favorite show besides The Leftovers. And there's a character, there's a father who we find out is a horrible man, but you find out way later on. And he's a man of, he's an esteemed person in the community. His wife, we find out, has been drugged and or drugging herself to stay quiet and complacent. And when I hear these stories, like with Jose and so many other stories out of California in particular, it just seems like David Lynch must have seen something out there or just understood the culture of Hollywood, because it seems like such a metaphor for so much that happens out there. I really recommend that show because it speaks so much to this evil stuff.
It actually made me think of the movie Iron Claw. Did you ever see that? It's a newer movie.
Yes.
I mean, that takes place in Texas, but it's the same thing. The father is, he's a wrestler, but he's very persistent with his children and forces them into sports. And like, he's kind of verbally abusive. You don't see any physical abuse, but like, it's kind of insane. And that family goes through torture itself. And the mother doesn't do anything. She just is complicit. She doesn't, doesn't stand up for her children. And I don't know, it's worth watching.
But honestly, it might also not be just a metaphor for Hollywood, even though it's depraved out there. But this is something that's not just in Hollywood. Like we were saying earlier with the monsters, it is everywhere. And I don't know if
it could also just be generational too.
For sure, generational. You don't know what happened, beyond that. And it makes me think of the story of there's a family that had all their kids, had a lot of kids, and they were just held captive in the basement their entire lives. Have you seen this story?
I know what you're talking about.
And the mom, was just powerless and did nothing, for various reasons. I don't really know why, but again, they're in a totally detached reality. The father was working for Lockheed Martin, which I always thought was weird, but the one of them eventually got out, and those kids were saved the horrible thing about that story is that those kids were saved and then put into foster care, and they were abused in the system. It's disgusting. So okay.
Can I say something about the mom too?
Yeah,
please. Quickly, because a great deal of ire has been directed at the Menendez brothers for the fact that they also killed the mother. And I just want to say several things. They have stated that their mother, for years and years, seemed so miserable and talked about suicide constantly that they really believed that they were committing a kind of euthanasia of her, that she was miserable, et cetera. And so I don't know. I think people need to understand that, again, in sort of a crazy way, there's a kind of logic to this.
I have a hard time with the murder still, despite knowing what happened. Like, I go back and forth on this idea of, because I don't even agree with capital punishment. You know, I would prefer to see these people just put away forever and rot. You know, I don't agree with murder. You know, even though I struggle with this when it comes to the abuse of kids, because like I wrote this story about, you know, we went and captured some pedophiles in Ohio about a year ago. And that was, all I saw was red in my brain. I just like, these people need to be taken care of. But morally, I have a very hard time with even accepting the idea of murder. And I'd want to put them away, remove them from society. But I can't, you know, put myself obviously in the Menendez brothers' shoes because of the years of horrible abuse they went through. And it's hard to stomach even hearing, you know, them taking their mother's life. I heard the case that they made for her being so depressed and suicidal. I think they even maybe found a letter from her, right?
Oh, she would leave them letters frequently because she wanted them to know how miserable she was, and she was always telling them. She would threaten to poison the family too and stuff like that. But yes,
wow.
But let me just say also, Shane, I don't think anyone, not me, and certainly not the Menendez brothers, claims that this was a justified act,
right? In
the sense, or not justified. I don't think anyone thinks that this is something that society should condone, or that this was a good way for them to deal with things. And, you know, people should look into this and should listen to what the Menendez brothers have been saying for years, that they really regret it. And Eric regretted it so much that he ended up having to go and squeal to his shrink, who ended up getting them turned in, you know, because he was so guilt-ridden about it. Lyle also, a lot of people don't know this, Lyle wrote a letter to Eric in prison, and it was supposed to be in jail when they were awaiting trial. And it was supposed to be just between them, but the guards ended up finding it during a search. And Lyle had just assumed that Eric would destroy it because he would send him these letters and then he would write, "Please destroy," after reading. So it was just for Eric. No one else was supposed to see it, right? But in the letter, Lyle talks about how he is reluctant to expose the family secrets because he feels so bad about ruining their parents' reputation.
Wow.
And so there was a lot of reluctance. People don't understand this. There was a great deal of reluctance initially on the part of the Menendez brothers to use this defense, even though they had experienced these things, because they actually felt a great deal of allegiance to their father and mother still, even though they killed them. Right. And so I just want people to understand that there's been a great deal of regret expressed by the Menendez brothers, and that no one is saying that this is the proper way to handle a situation like this. I think that what most of us are saying, though, is that this seems like a very clear manslaughter case that should not have gotten these guys a life sentence in prison. Right. And so they have served 35 years. And so for the people who say we can't condone vigilante justice, well, they've served 35 years. Right. The better part of their lives, their youth at least, is over.
And if it is manslaughter, that's well beyond what you would serve in the state of California. You know, do we know why it happened that day? What led to that being the day after so long of enduring the abuse? You know, do we know why they chose to do it that day?
Well, the Menendez brothers claim, of course, we don't know, right? But the Menendez brothers claim that it happened because the sexual abuse had finally broken out into the open in their family, in the sense that it was something that Lyle, the older brother, found out that the younger brother was still being molested or raped by the father. He thought that it had ended. Wow. So when he found that out, he freaks out. He confronts the dad. The dad tells him, he says, basically, F off. I can do whatever I want with my son. Lyle goes to the mom, and Lyle and Eric, and she basically says, yeah, I knew. What of it? And so he claims, the Menendez brothers claim that they got really freaked out because they realized at this point that everything now was sort of exposed, and that their parents might feel vulnerable now with this thing having having broken out into the open, their parents might feel like they were in a vulnerable position and they might want to off their children, basically.
Wow.
And another consideration was that Jose Menendez recently had expressed to his children that he was basically sort of done with them because they had been such disappointments, and he was sort of going to move on with his life and his own dreams and plans instead of really facilitating theirs anymore. And so they had this feeling that their father had basically washed their hands of them, and that therefore now they were kind of a liability, and that their parents, they claimed that they really felt in their crazy state that their parents could kill them.
Right.
And they said that they were terrified of their parents. And so that's what they claim. Now, the prosecution would claim that there were these other incentives, talking about financial stuff, a fear that they would be written out of the will, and these things. And I don't think that we'll ever really know. My guess is that it was probably a mixture of all of these different considerations and fears and incentives. But again, we're dealing with a crazy situation. And what I keep coming back to in this is that whatever monstrous behavior the brothers were guilty of, certainly the murders, gruesome, horrific, monstrous, and some of this other behavior, it was a direct result of what the victims did to them.
Right.
So I just don't see how we get away here from a certain reciprocal responsibility in this, which no, it doesn't completely justify the murders, but I do think it puts them in a different light, so that, again, we need to be more lenient on these guys, especially since, again, they've served a long sentence.
Yeah, and I believe in redemption, even something as ghastly as murder. And also, if you want to believe their side of the story in terms of they felt like the walls were closing in as a liability, if they've experienced years of like horrible abuse, it's not that far beyond the realm of possibility for them to think that they'd be murdered after.
Well, and he had threatened to kill them many times. I mean, both of the parents had. And again, the threat of murder had been hanging over them since they were children, because Eric testified, again, this is if we believe it, but Eric testified that when he was a child, at a certain point, he refused or tried to stand up to his father and say, I don't want to do this anymore, the sexual stuff, right? And he claims that the dad went and got a big knife and came back into the room and held the knife against his throat. And he said, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to kill you. So if that is true, and again, there's corroborating evidence, testimony that this was a bad man doing bad stuff. If that's true, then I can't imagine growing up in that environment and not being terrified of your parents.